Walter Vance knew that numbers did not lie, but the people pushing them sure as hell did. It started on a Tuesday morning with one of those pep rally meetings where they serve stale donuts and corporate delusion. The new vice president of finance, Julian Cole, fresh off his Master of Business Administration degree and probably still smelling like expensive body spray, was waving around a slide deck like he had cured cancer. Revenue was supposedly up 18%, margin stable, no risk factors, all sunshine and corporate optimism. Walter, sitting in the back with his notebook and 12 years of institutional memory, raised one eyebrow because he knew those numbers were wrong. They were not oopsie wrong. They were not forgot to carry the one wrong. They were strategically massaged like a casino dealer during a slow shift. Line items had been shifted, forecasts inflated, and risk disclosures conveniently trimmed. The corporate headquarters was a 20-story glass tower in downtown Chicago, a monument to administrative excess and high-for-frequency trading. Walter's workspace, however, was located on the basement level, right next to the server cooling fans. It was a space designed to keep him out of sight and out of mind. For 12 years, he had arrived at 7 in the morning sharp, carrying his thermos of black coffee and gone through the daily logs. He had seen 3 different chief executive officers come and go, each promising a new era of transparencies while quietly shifting debt to subsidiary accounts. Walter, who had built the company's compliance framework from the ground up over a decade ago, flagged 2 major discrepancies in his margin notes. One projection showed a massive vendor contract that had actually expired 6 weeks ago. Another listed deferred maintenance expenses that had magically vanished from the liability column. He raised his hand calmly, even offered a polite smile. "Just wondering," he said, "if the legal team reviewed these figures before they went to the board." Julian gave him that patronizing smirk, half frat boy and half corporate guru. "Thanks, Walter," Julian said. "But we are all good." They were not. Walter knew it. The same way you know when milk is turned before the sell-by date. The stench of overpromised quarterly growth and underreported liability was all over that deck. But Walter did not push. Not yet. He had learned his lesson years ago in this corporate jungle. Do not interrupt the show until the spotlight hits you. So he filed his notes, went back to his desk, and quietly started saving backup copies of everything he could find. Now, before we go any further, yes, you listening while driving, folding laundry, or hiding from your family in the garage, 97% of you do not subscribe. That number is uglier than Julian's accounting. If you want to hear how Walter makes this entire boardroom regret their arrogance, hit that follow button. It costs you nothing. But for our team, it means we can keep exposing corporate nonsense with a smirk. Anyway, Walter had spent 12 years in compliance. He was the kind of man who never missed a decimal, never gossiped, and never complained. Human resources called him low maintenance. Leadership called him reliable. Both meant we will never promote you, but God help us if you quit. And Walter knew his value. He was the duct tape holding this rusted corporate machine together. He kept the safety violations from stacking, the regulatory inquiries from arriving, and the executive suite from emailing each other, things that could be subpoenaed. Because he did not wear flash suits or speak in trending buzzwords, he was invisible until he was not. He had spent years documenting every minor deviation, every skipped safety inspection, and every questionable journal entry, storing them in a secure place. Julian's arrival marked a shift. Suddenly, the chief financial officer stopped answering Walter's emails. Reports Walter used to review before board submissions started bypassing him. The air got thin. Human resources started using phrases like streamlining workflows and realigning compliance under finance. Walter saw the writing on the wall. It was in Comic Sans, written by fools. But still, he did not panic. He archived every policy revision, every quarterly adjustment, every sin-off chain, including one little gem he had slipped in back in 2017 during a compliance overhaul no one cared to read. Clause 12. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Walter sat in his cubicle, sipped lukewarm coffee from his world's best compliance officer mug, and listened to the whispers travel down the hallway like smoke before a fire because something was coming. And Walter, he was not just waiting. He was prepared. They called it a second quarter alignment meeting, which was corporate speak for bring your own noose. Walter knew it before he even sat down. The energy in the room had that weird, sterile buzz like a dentist's office where someone had already screamed. The chief financial officer, Lawrence Barlow, mid-50s, with a rehearsed grin and expensive teeth, opened with a talk about margin preservation and operational fluidity. Translation: bodies are about to hit the floor. Julian, the arrogant new vice president, was standing behind Lawrence with his arms crossed like a bouncer at a club. Walter counted 3 slides before the ambush. And in the spirit of long-term fiscal sustainability, Lawrence droned, "We have made some difficult decisions. As of today, we are restructuring certain non-revenue departments to streamline overhead." Walter did not flinch. He just set his pen down and waited. That is when Lawrence's eyes flicked to him. "Walter," Lawrence said, trying to soften it with a tilt of his head, "your position will be absorbed under finance effective immediately. We appreciate your many years of service." "Absorbed," Walter repeated, like he was tasting a bitter medicine. "Yes," Lawrence said. "You will be provided with an offboarding packet and assistance in the transition." Walter blinked once. "Is there a severance?" That question stopped the room cold. The company's in-house lawyer, Donald Croft, buttoned down and running on pure arrogance, actually laughed, a real chesty chuckle. "Oh, Walter," Donald said, shaking his head. "No man negotiates severance here." There it was. The sentence that would echo in Walter's mind. He said nothing. Not to Donald, not to Lawrence, not to Julian, who suddenly found the carpet very interesting. Walter just looked down at the notebook in his lap and quietly closed it. Human Resources showed up 3 minutes later with a manila envelope and a security badge already deactivated. A younger woman named Clara mumbled something about next steps while offering Walter a cardboard box and the world's most insincere smile. "Let us know if you need help carrying anything." Walter did not answer. He packed slowly, intentionally. He removed his certificates from the wall, a small framed picture of his late wife, and unpinned a faded sticky note that said, "Check Clause 12 may need it someday." He slid it into his wallet like a loaded round. The older security guard, who had worked there for 10 years and knew Walter well, gave him a sad nod as he guided him out. They did not even offer a handshake. He walked out under flickering fluorescent lights, past the display case of dusty corporate awards, and past the break room where someone had already claimed his favorite chair. The world kept spinning like he had never existed. But beneath the silence, his fury curled its fingers around his chest. Not loud, not messy, just tight enough to focus his breathing. They thought he would fold. That is the thing about men like Lawrence and Donald. They do not see men like Walter until their whole foundation cracks open and swallows them. They think silence means surrender. They never imagine it means strategy. As he drove his old sedan home, the steering wheel felt cold under his fingers. The highway was jammed with commuters, all of them chasing the same corporate carrot, unaware of how quickly they could be sliced out of the budget. Walter had dedicated his entire adult life to the firm. When his wife had passed away 5 years ago, he had buried his grief in compliance reports, working 70-hour weeks to ensure the company did not violate any state regulations. He had believed that his loyalty would be repaid with basic professional respect. Instead, he had been escorted out of the building like a shoplifter. The first night, Walter did not cry. He just sat at his kitchen table in sweatpants and stared at the severance packet. It sat on the table like a dead animal. Next to it, a half-empty glass of water, a cheap microwave dinner, and the kind of silence that hums just loud enough to remind you that you are completely on your own. He stared at the envelope. Inside was a line saying, "You agree to forfeit any and all claims related to your employment or termination," the legal equivalent of taking crumbs and being grateful. He took a slow sip of water, staring at the window. His cat, Barnaby, jumped up on the table, sniffing the cardboard box before settling next to Walter's laptop. His mind drifted back to the old days, back when no one gave a damn what compliance did. So he rebuilt it from scratch, quietly, thoroughly, and slipped in protections no one noticed because no one thought he mattered. And that is when it hit him. Clause 12. He said it aloud, a whisper at first. Clause 12. It had been a rainy Wednesday back in 2017. The chief financial officer at the time was too busy playing golf with auditors to review anything longer than a page. Walter had restructured their entire risk policy that month. Tucked into the back pages of a 40-page document was a clause that triggered a massive severance and triple back pay if a restructuring followed a material misstatement of financial projections. At the time, it was just insurance. Now, it was a noose for them. He set down his glass, walked to the living room, and pulled out the battered fireproof box from under his desk. Inside were 2 thumb drives labeled Archive and Backup. He plugged one into his laptop, his fingers steady now. Memos, forecast versions, time-stamped files, emails with track changes. His heartbeat slowed. This was not hope, this was ammunition. And he knew exactly who to call. He had not spoken to Peter Henderson in over a year. Life, distance, the usual. But Peter had been his roommate in law school. Fierce, brilliant, the kind of man who once argued a parking ticket all the way to a state judge just to prove a point. Now Peter was a partner at a boutique employment law firm that specialized in corporate disputes. Walter did not overthink it. He just dialed. "Walter Vance," Peter answered, his voice sharp as ever. "Please tell me you are calling for a catch-up and not revenge." Walter took a breath. "A little bit of both," he said, "but mostly revenge." He could hear Peter's grin. "Tell me everything." And so Walter did, slowly, carefully, file by file, phrase by phrase. And when he got to clause 12, there was a pause, a long one. "Send me the language," Peter finally said. "Right now." Walter did, and the next words Peter spoke made Walter's hand tighten on the phone. "This clause," Peter said, "is not a warning shot. It is a thermonuclear warhead, and you have been sitting on it for 7 years. Walter looked at the severance envelope again, then picked it up and dropped it directly into the trash. Peter called back the next morning before the sun was up. Walter was in his kitchen, coffee cup clutched like a weapon. He had not slept, not really, just drifted in and out, haunted by spreadsheets and the sound of Donald Croft's laugh echoing in his mind. "Clause 12, Peter said, skipping hello. "I read it 5 times, Walter. It is airtight. If their quarterly report contains anything even close to a misstatement, and you were restructured afterward, they owe you everything. We are talking triple damages, back pay, and full legal fees." Walter did not smile. Not yet. He just said, "Then let us begin." Peter's voice dropped an octave. "We will do this clean. No press, no warning. Let us make them think you went quietly into the corporate night." And just like that, the machine roared to life. Walter pulled out every thumb drive, every encrypted file, every memo he had hoarded under the doctrine of cover your assets. It was like going through his own digital archives. He had audit trails, email threads, metadata so old it referenced legacy systems. If someone so much as adjusted a spreadsheet, Walter had the timestamp. Peter built a secure folder, organizing everything by date, topic, and executive signature. They were surgical. No fluff, no emotion, just hard evidence. They cross-referenced Walter's termination date against the company's first quarter and second quarter earnings reports. They flagged 4 major discrepancies, 3 omitted disclosures, and 1 damning forecast note that had been revised after the official filing date. That one made Peter say a quiet prayer. The issue was a massive off-balance sheet lease liability for server equipment that Julian had tried to hide to make the company's earnings look stronger before a major bond offering. It was a clear violation of public accounting standards. They ordered pizza, spread the spreadsheets across Peter's conference table, and worked late into the night, tracing the audit trails. The system logs showed exactly whose user credentials had accessed the server to alter the numbers at 3 in the morning on a Sunday. It was Julian's personal account, and the IP address matched his home office. This was not a mistake. It was a premeditated cover-up. Peter paced around his office, holding a thick legal volume on corporate governance. In Delaware, where the company was incorporated, the business judgment rule normally protects directors from personal liability. Peter explained as he poured 2 cups of water. But that protection is not absolute. If a compliance officer formally notifies the board of a material financial misstatement, and the board ignores that warning to proceed with a restructuring that eliminates that officer, it is no longer a simple business decision. It becomes a breach of the duty of loyalty and active concealment of fraud. The directors lose their corporate shield. That is why we cede the board members. We did not just threaten a lawsuit, we threatened their personal bank accounts. Walter just sipped his coffee, watching the dots connect. Next came the legal moves. Peter filed what he called a quiet signal, A formal inquiry delivered via courier. No threats, just a precise legal question. In light of adjusted earnings and the timeline of my client's termination, we request clarification on whether Clause 12B applies under your firm's current restructuring policy. It was sent directly to the legal department and copied to the board members. Walter's name was not on it. Not yet. Within 48 hours, they got their first response. A short, vague email from Human Resources. We would be happy to reopen discussions regarding Mr. Vance's exit package. Perhaps we can find a resolution. Peter snorted when he read it. Lawrence and Donald just realized the bomb under their table is ticking, Peter said. Walter did not answer. He was scrolling through his inbox from 6 months ago, hunting for drafts he remembered flagging. He found it. A memorandum about growth forecasting where someone had commented, "Adjust language here. Too risky to disclose debt restructuring." That memo had been signed by Donald Croft's usual signature. Walter saved it. He did not feel triumphant. He felt clinical. Each file was not revenge. It was a cold, meticulous post-mortem of how men in power had written him off, because they thought he was just an old man they could toss aside. They did not need a driver. They had documentation. And now, with Peter steering the ship and Clause 12 strapped to the mast, Walter stepped fully into the fight. By noon, the silence broke. A single text message lit up. Walter's phone. "Unknown number. They are panicking. Lawrence said you had the nuke." Walter stared at the message, reread it, then typed back slowly, "Who is this?" The reply came, "You helped me fix my expense reports when Julian wanted me to hide a vendor overage. I never forgot. Just be careful. They are calling lawyers. They are meeting late." Walter exhaled, sat back, and finally let himself feel a moment of relief. It was not loud, because now he had something Lawrence, Donald, and Julian would never understand. Someone on the inside who still cared about what was right. He did not respond again. He did not need to do so. He just opened a new folder on his laptop labeled whistleblower files. Then he got dressed. A nice blazer, clean jeans, no fuss. He drove to the local library like it was any other day. He found a quiet room, plugged in, and started digging deeper into the regulatory rules. He knew that under Rule 10b-5 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, filing false financial projections was a major federal offense. Under Section 806 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, retaliating against a compliance officer who flags these misstatements carries severe criminal penalties and automatic reinstatement with double back pay. They had not just violated his employment contract. They had walked directly into a federal buzzsaw. By copying the board on the initial inquiry, Peter had triggered a corporate governance rule under Delaware law. The directors were now personally aware of potential securities fraud. If they signed off on any further misleading reports, they could lose their liability protection, exposing their personal assets to shareholder lawsuits. It was a massive leverage point. Inside his archive folders, Walter found more. Donald Croft had a habit of forwarding sensitive files to his personal email for weekend review. Sloppy. But lucky for Walter, who had copied the original server logs before his access was cut. Peter flagged a few entries with the enthusiasm of a predator. "This shows Donald reviewed the projection edit after the board presentation," Peter said. "That means the misstatement was a conscious decision." "Is that enough for Clause 12? Walter asked. "Oh, it is enough for Clause 12 and a federal investigation," Peter said. "But they did not go public. That was the plan. Quiet, surgical, make them sweat." By Friday, Human Resources called again. This time the voicemail used new language. Final opportunity to resolve in good faith. Walter did not bother forwarding it. He just wrote down the date, the time, and underlined the phrase "final opportunity." Because what they did not know was that their opportunity had already passed, and the fuse was burning down. The quarterly report dropped like a lead weight. A dull cover, polite formatting, the usual corporate accounting. But Walter flipped straight to the back, where the real stories live, the footnotes. Page 37, subsection 4. Subsequent to our prior filing, management determined projections did not account for deferred liabilities associated with equipment leasing. Adjustments have been made to reflect a more accurate picture of growth. Walter did not even blink. That sentence, sterile and buried, was the exact tripwire in Clause 12. A material misstatement of financial projections resulting in departmental realignment. Walter sent a screenshot to Peter. One word followed, go. The arbitration request was submitted by noon. A neutral venue, a private setting, no press. Walter did not want fireworks. He wanted an autopsy. They chose a conference room in a downtown office, glass walls, minimalist art, fake plants that looked exhausted. The air conditioning was freezing. At 9:58 in the morning, Walter arrived in a gray blazer and calm eyes. He did not carry a briefcase, just a slim folder labeled Clause 12 Final. Peter came in behind him, expression calm and focused. At 10:02 in the morning, the door opened. Donald Croft walked in first, a fake grin locked in place. Behind him came Lawrence Barlow, the chief financial officer. Lawrence looked pale, sweaty, like he had not slept in 3 days, because he had not. The whispers inside the company had gotten louder. But Lawrence only heard one word over and over, clause. 2 board members entered behind them. Older men with expensive watches and expressions of annoyance. Walter did not stand. He did not speak. He just looked at the clock. 10:05 in the morning. Peter cleared his throat. "Thank you for joining us," he said. "I would like to begin by referencing an internal document that you all know well. Clause 12 of the Corporate Compliance Policy revised in 2017. Donald Croft chuckled. "We are aware of your interpretation," he said, but Peter held up one finger. "Not interpretation," Peter said, "application." He reached into his briefcase and slid a printed copy of the quarterly report across the table, with page 37 circled in red. Then, with the other hand, he slid Walter's original compliance revision behind it. Clause 12 was highlighted in yellow. Donald's smirk vanished. Lawrence's mouth twitched. The room fell into a heavy silence. They had seen this coming. They had just hoped Walter would not pull the trigger. Peter leaned forward. "This revision constitutes a material misstatement under Rule 10b-5 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, Peter said. "You filed projections that ignored known liabilities, which triggered departmental realignment, specifically the termination of my client. Under Clause 12, that action entitles him to severance, triple damages, and full legal compensation." Donald opened his mouth, but Peter held up another sheet. A company email from 6 weeks prior from Lawrence, timestamped. "I am aware this report does not reflect lease obligations. We will adjust that later." Silence again, but now it was not calm. It was a reckoning. One of the board members, Bradley Jenkins, finally cleared his throat. "What are your demands?" he asked. Peter spoke. "Full enforcement of Clause 12. Settlement of damages totaling $1,470,000. A formal letter acknowledging wrongful restructuring and a confidentiality agreement signed within 10 business days." Lawrence looked like he might throw up. Donald tried to laugh, but it came out as a weak cough. Donald leaned forward, trying to argue a final defense. "Walter was terminated for restructuring reasons," Donald argued. "But the compliance department itself was not restructured. We just eliminated one redundant role." Peter smiled, sliding a copy of the company's internal restructuring announcement across the table. "In your own memo, Donald, you wrote that the compliance operations are being consolidated under the finance group," Peter said. "That is a departmental realignment by definition. You cannot rewrite reality to escape your own contract." Bradley Jenkins leaned across the table, his knuckles turning white as he pressed them against the polished wood. He looked at Lawrence, his voice dropping to a low, furious rumble. "Lawrence, did you receive the compliance warnings from Walter's department prior to signing the first quarter certification?" Bradley asked. Lawrence opened his mouth to lie, but Peter immediately slid a copy of the electronic delivery receipt across the table, showing Lawrence had opened and read the compliance email at 10:42 in the morning on the day of the board vote. Lawrence's silence was his confession. Bradley turned to Donald, his eyes blazing. "And you, Donald, as our counsel, did you advise the board that these warnings were resolved?" Donald's face was completely white, his hands trembling as he tried to adjust his tie. Bradley Jenkins glared at Donald, realizing the company's lawyer had just walked them into a corner. And Walter? He just sat still, calm, silent. He did not need to scream to make the walls shake. The silence shattered with the sound of porcelain hitting marble. Lawrence's coffee mug slipped through his sweaty fingers, spraying coffee across the floor. No one moved. The spill spread outward, pooling at his feet. Donald's face flushed an ugly shade of red. His mouth opened and closed without sound. This was the man who had laughed at Clause 12, dismissing compliance as a fantasy. Now his ignorance sat on the table, highlighted and mocking him. Walter did not say a word. Finally, Bradley Jenkins turned to Lawrence. "Is this accurate? Did we file misleading projections?" Lawrence stumbled through words, his voice thin. "There was context," he whispered. Peter cut him off. "Misstatements," Peter said, "not context." Donald tried to speak. "We are prepared to offer a settlement of 2 months' salary to close this quickly," Donald said. 2 months? Walter did not blink. He had waited too long to dignify that insult. Peter snorted. "Clause 12 explicitly entitles my client to triple damages, back pay, and full legal fees," Peter said. 2 months does not cover the ink on this paper. Bradley Jenkins looked at Lawrence with fury. "Triple damages," Bradley said. "Is that not aggressive?" Peter did not blink. "Your chief financial officer's email shows deliberate intent to conceal liabilities," Peter said. "That is fraud under Delaware General Corporation law. Fraud carries implications beyond financial damages, Securities Exchange Commission exposure, shareholder lawsuits. Shall I continue?" Walter watched Lawrence's eyes dart around the room, hunting for an escape. Donald's smirk was long gone. Bradley Jenkins finally spoke. "What is the number to make this disappear quietly?" Peter slid another sheet of paper across the table. $1,470,000, Peter said. "Confidentiality signed immediately. Formal letter delivered by Friday." Bradley Jenkins looked at Lawrence like he wanted to throw him out of the window. "We need 48 hours to discuss," Bradley said. "You have 48 hours, Peter said, standing up. "Then we file publicly with exhibits." The words dropped into the room like heavy stones. Donald looked ill. Lawrence stared at the puddle on the floor. Bradley Jenkins pinched his nose. Walter remained still. He knew exactly how this ended. They would squirm, they would threaten, and then they would fold. Because while they played checkers, Walter had played chess. They tried one last stall. Rumors were leaked within the company, suggesting Walter had performance issues. The smear campaign was quiet, designed to exhaust him, but Walter remained calm. Desperation smelled exactly like that. "They have gossip," Walter told Peter. "We have Clause 12, and then the final piece fell into place." The informant, Neil, sent a forwarded email thread between Lawrence, Donald, and Julian, discussing how they would get rid of Walter to avoid compliance issues. The subject line was, "Compliance bottleneck." Julian had written, "Walter won't be an issue after Thursday." Walter forwarded it to Peter with a single line, courtesy copy to the board. The next morning, the board called an emergency meeting, no more delays. At 6:14 in the evening, Peter texted, "They folded. Settlement confirmed. Lawrence Barlow is on indefinite leave. Donald Croft is terminated. Check tomorrow." The final meeting was short. Walter sat at the polished table, expression calm, hands folded. Peter sat beside him, signing the final agreement. Bradley Jenkins signed for the board. Lawrence and Donald were absent, represented by their empty chairs. Walter took the check and the signed contract, sliding them neatly into his folder. He stood up slowly, deliberately, still without saying a word. His silence radiated absolute control. Together, he and Peter walked out. In the hallway, the elevator doors opened. Walter stepped inside. Peter looked at him. "You okay?" Peter asked. Walter smiled gently, looking at the reflection in the chrome door. "No man negotiates severance here," Walter echoed softly. "Guess I just did." The elevator descended quietly, just like Walter had executed every step of his plan. He stepped into the warm sunlight, his shoulders back, chin high, completely vindicated. He did not need applause. He had quiet victory, absolute dignity, and the certainty that the invisible man had finally made them see. What stands out most here is the power of being quietly prepared. Sometimes the best revenge is not explosive. It is silent, precise, and utterly irrefutable. True career justice often comes from a deep understanding of the system, patience, and the courage to let facts speak louder than fury. In the end, it is not about how loud you shout, but how well you play the game. Big thanks for watching, you sneaky seniors. Subscribe to keep the coffee pot brewing revenge. Your ex-colleagues won't know what hit them.